Welcome back to the third and final lecture on American Yawp, Chapter 22 on the Roaring Twenties. I'm going to pick up where we left off. We finished with speakeasies and prohibition and the rise of organized crime with Al Capone, and now we are going to talk about the quote-unquote new woman. So the 1920s saw an increase in materialism and individual pleasure. We saw a rejection of old Victorian values of modesty and self-restraint. People began going to cabarets or dance clubs, Nickelodeons, which were clubs, and speakeasies. There's greater independence and freedom of movement around the United States, but in particular in cities, especially for women. And for the first time, half of women were working outside of the house. Most women worked in professions like teaching and nursing, and it was difficult for them to rise to leadership positions. But nonetheless, disposable income was on the increase for families and women. The flapper generation of young women who wore short skirts, bobbed hair, listened to jazz music, wore makeup, drank alcohol, smoked cigarettes, drove automobiles, and often engaged in casual sex. Older conservative generations saw flappers as irresponsible. So you can kind of think of flappers as modernity coming into collision with tradition. Here you see some different images of swimwear. So in 1915, you see some first really swimwear. Obviously, this is much more modest than the type of things we see today, but swimwear for men and women changed in the 1920s. The first photo on the left is from 1915, while the second is from the 1920s. Policemen would measure how short women's one-piece swimwear was, and if it was too short, they could be arrested. So, obviously, again, you have a situation of modern fashion coming into conflict with tradition and modesty. Now, at the Harlem Renaissance. Many black Americans went to New York City during the Great Migration, and as we've already discussed, went to other places as well, like Chicago, Detroit, the Los Angeles, San Diego area, and various other cities. The Great Migration, again, was when African Americans migrated from the South to the North to escape discrimination and to find jobs during World War I. And the Great Migration just continued through the 1920s and 1930s. In 1910, there were 91,707 black Americans in New York City, and by 1930, that number had grown to 327,706. So we're talking about a pretty significant population shift. By 1930, 98,620 foreign-born black people migrated to the United States. 50% of them moved to Harlem. Harlem, as you may be aware, is located in Manhattan between 5th Avenue and 8th Avenue and 130th Street and 155th Street. So it is a borough, a neighborhood in New York City. At the time, mostly African Americans lived in Harlem, and the Harlem Renaissance, which is often referred to as the New Negro Movement, which was popularized by Elaine Locke's book entitled The New Negro. That term, coined during the Harlem Renaissance, was a time of outspoken advocacy of dignity and a refusal to be subservient. The time of intellectual and cultural awakening of black American music, dance, literature, arts, politics, that all originated in, again, Harlem, New York City. Much of the foundation of the Harlem Renaissance comes from earlier generations of African Americans. So it is not that all of a sudden you have a flourishing of culture. What the Harlem Renaissance really shows is that there was something unique about black culture that already existed, right? And it is just flourishing and becoming part of popular American culture by the time the 1920s roll around. The Harlem Renaissance influenced black writers in the Caribbean and Europe. Some prominent figures from the Harlem Renaissance include Langston Hughes, who was a poet, social activist, a novelist, a playwright, and a columnist. Claude McKay was a Jamaican writer and poet. He wrote If We Must Die as a response to mob attacks on African Americans during the Red Summer of 1919. And Zora Neale Hurston was an anthropologist, author, and a filmmaker who portrayed racial struggles in the South. Hurston also did research on hoodoo, which is spiritual dances, traditions, and beliefs created by African slaves and held secret from slaveholders, traditions that evolved from African religions. So it's really showcasing the connection of culture between Africa and various places in the African diaspora. And this is that poem, If We Must Die, by Claude McKay. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an unglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall the constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. This is a poem. Again, it was published by Claude McKay in 1919 and written in response to the Red Summer 1919 as mob violence and race riots in major cities around the United States. Hundreds of people were killed in the violence, and the poem represents persecuted groups, and it's one of the most famous poems of all time. Now on to the issue of jazz. This is a music genre that originated in African American communities in New Orleans. Louis Armstrong was the most influential figure in jazz in the inception of jazz. The Roaring Twenties is often referred to as the Jazz Age, and jazz helped shape the Harlem Renaissance. Besides literature and music, there was also a significant political movement that grew out of the Harlem Renaissance. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, was founded by Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican immigrant. It built the largest black nationalist organization in the world. It was inspired by Pan-Africanism and Booker T. Washington's model of industrial education. Pan-Africanism is a worldwide movement that encourages bonds of solidarity between indigenous and diaspora ethnic groups of African descent. Booker T. Washington encouraged industrial education for black Americans, and the UNIA was critical of W.E.B. Du Bois. So remember, W.E.B. Du Bois had founded the NAACP. So you have a little bit of consternation here between what would be civil rights leaders of the time. The movement encouraged black economic independence as a way to root out racial oppression. They published the weekly newspaper, Marcus Garvey, that is, published the weekly newspaper, Negro World. They organized parades. UNIA members, known as Garveyites, dressed in military uniforms and marched down the streets in Harlem. They started the Black Star Line, which were passenger ships that were black-owned, black-staffed, and would only carry black people between the Americas and Africa. And the UNIA would not accept funding from white people. Garvey would later be deported for mail fraud, and the UNIA never recovered from that. Garvey would later be pardoned. And Garvey, was a controversial figure as he supported black Americans to move back to Africa. And the important part here is that the UNIA would later would inspire later movements. For example, Malcolm X during the Civil Rights Movement was inspired by the movement because his parents were Garveyites. We've talked a lot about various modernity in various modes of modernism in the 1920s, coming to a head with traditional values, and that's where fundamental Christianity comes into play. So new Christian fundamentalists in the 1920s were concerned about sexual mores and social freedoms. They fought immorality. Protestants challenged Catholicism, women's sexual freedom, public entertainment, bootleggers, and speakeasies. They opposed modernists of the era who argued miracles in the Bible were metaphorical. They also opposed the social gospel, which was often tied to liberal theology. Social gospel was a social Protestant movement that applied Christianity to social problems in the early 1900s, particularly during the Progressive era. For example, trying to deal with economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, racial tension, slums, and many more issues. The Fundamentals. In 1910, evangelist A.C. Dixon commissioned 90 essays entitled The Fundamentals to combat religious liberalism, and this gave fundamental Christianity its name. Evangelists believed in literal truths in the Bible, for example, that Jesus would return to earth and redeem the righteous and damn the wicked. We see modern science, modernism in general, coming to a head with fundamental Christianity as it's played out through the Scopes monkey trial. John T. Scopes was tried for teaching evolutionary theory, which violated the Butler Act that said publicly financed schools could not teach anything but biblical creation. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, wanted a volunteer to challenge the Butler Act so the case would be brought before the Supreme Court. Scopes was that volunteer. There was no question he broke the law. And this trial was significant at the time. It was labeled the trial of the century. Newspapers flooded to Dayton, Tennessee, where the trial was taking place. The case was about religious liberty and academic freedom, parental rights, and moral responsibility. The lawyers involved, Clarence Darrow was a liberal from Chicago who volunteered to defend Scopes. He was a famous trial lawyer. And then the three-time failed presidential candidate, populist candidate, William Jennings Bryan, was the prosecutor. William Jennings Bryan took the stand, gave incoherent testimony. It was really a public relations disaster, and it showed that he did not actually believe in the literal wording of the Bible. Darrow asked unanswerable questions, and nonetheless, John T. Scopes was found guilty. The verdict was announced within minutes of the jury leaving the courtroom to deliberate, and the verdict would actually be later thrown out on technicalities. Few people really cared about the verdict. Darrow won in the public decision. Fundamentalist Christians retreated and would not reemerge until decades later. But nonetheless, this case really showcased the clashing worlds of the 1920s. And then the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. It reemerged in the early 1900s. The new KKK was against African Americans, immigrants, Catholics, modernists, feminists, Jews, atheists, and bootleggers. They claimed to be protectors of the traditional American way of life. In 1915, the movie Birth of a Nation inspired the rebirth of the KKK. It was a silent drama film that glorified the KKK from the Reconstruction era as feminine virtue and white racial purity were the main themes of the film. The KKK had elaborate rituals that were showcased in the film, and while it was started in Georgia and Alabama, it quickly spread throughout the entire country, especially as a business entity. Because of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North, the KKK ultimately expanded north of the Mason-Dixon line, and there were even some chapters in Canada. At the height of the 1920s, the KKK had about 5 million members. They endorsed mayoral candidates. In some states, politicians needed support from the Klan in order to win elections. They recruited members through fraternal organizations like the Freemasons and through churches. And they engaged in something called night riding. Night riding was physical harassment of bootleggers and union activists, civil rights workers, adulterers, and other people that they deemed as undesirable. Night riding often took the form of cross burning outside of people's homes, and then all the way up to more violent acts like lynchings. The Birth of a Nation was the first movie to be screened at the White House during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson received a fair amount of criticism for it. And there's some dispute on Wilson's feelings on the movie, but nonetheless, the popularity of the movie and the political connection, just in conjunction with American society at the time, really drove the demand for the recreation of the KKK. So a few final thoughts to wrap up here. So in 1929, the newly elected president, Herbert Hoover, said Republicans had brought prosperity to the United States. However, the U.S. economy was built on credit. Income, wealth inequality was quite high. There was a construction bubble. European economies were beginning to fail, and a depression was about to change everything. So the Roaring Twenties would come to a conclusion with the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that would follow. All right, that is a wrap for American Yawp, Chapter 22. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me in class. Thanks for listening.